Welcome to another video. Today it is the sew along for the Simplicity 8445 shirt, which is the shirt that I'm wearing now. I'm going to try something a little bit different with the sew alongs coming up, and I'm going to put them all into one long video with chapters. So you should be able to skip ahead to the part that you want or skip back to the part that you want with a lot more ease, because there will be distinctive chapters that are named. So there's going to be the tracing and cutting out of the pattern and the altering of the pattern and so on and so forth through to the finished make. I'm also going to do the review at the beginning here because I know a lot of you are not going to want to watch right through to the end to see what I think about the shirt before you start making it. So I thought I would tell you right at the get-go how this went. I like this shirt. I don't love it, and I am not going to be making this again. It is a shirt with grown-on sleeves, and with as people with big busts can attest and have been telling me themselves, when you have all this excess fabric in this area here from having the sleeve grown on rather than set in, it just ends up looking a little bit sort of chunky in this area. Now loads of people were telling me that I should have gone for a lighter weight fabric. The pattern actually does call for cottons, cotton broadcloths, chambrays, things like that. Anything floatier, it wasn't on the recommended list of fabrics on the back, which is why I went for this lightweight quilting cotton. And it is a lightweight quilting cotton, it's not as heavy as some of my other ones. I have seen Raf from the Great British Sewing Bee make this shirt up in a nylon fabric. It looked great, it had structure in it. I think the whole purpose of this shirt is that all the fabrics that the pattern recommends for this shirt is that they have structure. The nylon that Raf used has structure, this cotton that I use had structure. It might be nicer in a rayon, but I have a sew along coming up for another top, the McCall 7810, and that is another top with grown on sleeves. I made that in a rayon and I have the same complaint. There's just too much fabric in this area. I'm really glad that I did the short sleeved one, because to begin with I was going to do the long sleeve one and I think that would have been even worse for me. This shirt also has a really strange design feature where you end up with a poof in the back. When I made this one and featured it in the weekly vlog or the daily waffle, it is a 1950s shirt. I had loads of you guys telling me that they were designed with that much kind of poof in the back so that they were workday shirts. They were designed to be functional shirts, they weren't designed to be dressy shirts. I did take this photo when I had first finished the shirt as described by the pattern, and that poof, I just didn't like it. I don't like poof in the back of any of my shirts or shirt dresses though. The McCall 6696 is one of them. I have completely eliminated because what should have been gathering, I turned it into a pleat and took some of the length out, and I have now completely eliminated that and substituted in a darted back for that shirt, and that's just a preference of mine. Loads of other people liked it. It was actually, you know what, it was about 50-50 down the middle for responses on this shirt when I showed it in the vlog. 50% of you were liking it with the poof and 50% of you were pleased that I'd contained the poof. I did that by sewing the tucks in the back portion. There are 3 on each side. I did that by sewing those up another 8.5 inches, and so there is a little bit of floof at the top because the back of this shirt is gathered into a semicircular yoke, so there is going to be some extra room up there. There is a little bit of that left, but not the giant kind of poof that I ended up with, and I just personally, for me, I didn't like it. I really didn't like it, which is why I sewed down those extra pleats. I liked how the pattern came together. I thought the instructions were great. The only thing I have changed is that I cut 2 yokes instead of 1 because I wanted to hide all of the raw edges inside of the shirt in that second yoke. And the sewing up of the tucks at the back are the only things that I have changed, and I will talk you through doing all of those things in this sew along. Whilst this is not a shirt for me, I do think it's a very nice shirt. I do like the very big collar. I think it's quite nice. I probably would wear it kind of like up like that, but it does tend to want to come down naturally as you wear it throughout the day. But if you use a slightly stiffer interfacing, I'm sure you could end up with slightly more upstanding collar, but I do like that. I like the semicircular yoke. I love the illustrations on the pattern envelope. I just don't like the end result on me, and again, that's just personal preference. I didn't make any alterations to the pattern. I traced out the straight size 14. I didn't even lengthen it, and there is quite a lot of shaping at the waist, and I probably could have gotten away with lengthening it just a touch, but you've seen me lengthen patterns before. It's very easy to do, and I decided not to on this one, just to give it a try, because I don't make very many simplicity patterns, so I thought I would give it a try and see how it came out. It's nice, but it's not for me. I don't think I will In fact, I know I will never make this again. And actually the last two sew-alongs that I've done, as I mentioned, this one and the McCall 7810, both had grown-on sleeves and have both just underlined for me that grown-on sleeves on dresses, on shirts, on tops, on coats are just not for me. Having said that, there is a caveat to that. When they finish, when the grown-on sleeve kind of just comes over the shoulder, edge of the shoulder here, the shoulder cap just comes over that, very much like the By Hand London Anna dress, of which I have made many, 34-ish I think. That I like, but anything longer than that, I just not a fan. So if this had come up and finished there, I mean obviously I'm bunching the fabric up, but if that had finished there, personally I prefer that length on me, and that's the only kind of grown on sleeve pattern that I've kept. I've gone through all of my patterns recently. The live hangouts have been pattern culls, and I have got rid of 118, and the vast majority of those had grown on sleeves. They were just immediate, like, this is lovely but just not for me. So having said all that, I do think the pattern was well written. I enjoyed putting this together. It didn't take me very long. I have made a few tweaks to it, which you will see in the coming sew along. This pattern was voted for by the Patreon peeps, whose name you will be seeing going across the bottom of the screen now. I'm really pleased that you guys voted for this one, because it was something that was slightly outside of my comfort zone. The other shirts that I'd put up as options were very safe, as it were, and this was probably the most out there of them. The illustrations on the envelope really made me want this. This pattern was a gift from Lorianne, so I'm very grateful for Lorianne for doing that, and I'm very grateful for you guys in the Patreon peeps for voting for this sew along, because it was an interesting experiment, but it's just not for me. So having said that, I hope you enjoy the sew along. I hope you find some useful things, tips and tricks in here, and as I say, everything will be chaptered so that you can easily skip ahead to pieces that you want to see if you're making this and you just want to see how I, for example, French seam something, or how I put in the extra internal yoke to cover all the raw edges up. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is iron your pattern tissue paper nice and flat. This will help you get an accurate trace. I do trace my patterns because they are expensive in the UK. I like to preserve the original tissue, make my alterations to a traced pattern, just in case something goes wrong, I have the original to come back to. Going by the pattern envelope, we need to find out what size we need to make. So for the body measurements, I'm between a 38 and a 40, and my bust is around about 38.5, 39, depending on the time of the month. The waist would be a 28, so technically I need a size 14, and then between a 16 and an 18, and I have the bundle that goes up to the size 14. Now I do that because these patterns include a lot of wearing ease. And if we look at the finished garment measurements, which you can find on the front bodice piece, the size 14, which is meant to be for a 36-inch bust, size 14, gives you a finished garment measurement of 40 inches. And it says here, total ease above body measurement is approximately 4 inches. Now, I personally don't like that much ease in shirts. I wouldn't wear it if it had that much ease in it, so I am going to trace the size 14 because it's the largest size that I have. The finished measurement is 40 inches, which is about 1.5 inches of wearing ease over my bust. That is a personal preference of mine. I will sometimes sew the front edge at 3/8 of an inch instead of 5/8 of an inch, just to give me that little bit extra room, but again, as I say, it's a personal preference. I am also going to write down all of the pattern pieces that I need to trace, just so that I don't forget anything as I'm going. So I'm doing a size 14, and I'm going to need to trace pattern piece number 1, it's the front and the sleeve, and I'm doing view C for this one. I don't like grown on sleeves. I find that they get quite bunchy under the arms, so I was going to do the longer sleeve version, but I think I wouldn't enjoy wearing it as much as I would the shorter sleeve one, so I'm doing view C. So I need piece 1, then I need piece 2, which is the back and sleeve. I need piece 3, which is the yoke, piece 4, which is the facing. I don't need the continuous lap because that's for A, as is the cuff, which is piece 6. I don't need the sleeve band or cuff 7 or 8 for view B. I do need the sleeve band for C, which is piece 9, sleeve facing for C, which is piece 10. So I'm going to be tracing 1, 2, 3, 4, 9 and 10. I will cross them off as I go, so I'm going to get that done next. Okay, so I have traced all my pieces out. I have written on the name of the pattern, what piece it is, the size that I've traced, and how many I need to cut. So we've got the sleeve facing, the sleeve band, the front facing, the back yoke, the front bodice, spare piece of paper, and back bodice. So I now need to iron and cut out my fabric. Now, the pattern recommends broadcloth, chambray, cotton types, dupioni, linen types, pique, shanting, taffeta, extra fabric needed to match plaids, stripes, or one-way fabric designs. This is the kind of shirt that is going to want something with a little bit of structure in there. So like a cotton lawn would be or cotton voile would be the lightest that I would go for. I am going to be using this cotton poplin, and I need to give this a quick iron, and then I'm going to get it cut out. I think it's going to be really, really pretty. Okay, one of the first things that we need to do is transfer over all the markings from the pattern piece to the fabric pieces. So for these open-ended darts or tucks, I have clipped into the end of each of the tucks, and I have then put a pin through the fabric and the pattern to mark the points of the tucks. And I'm going to peel back the top layer of fabric and the pattern piece, and then I'm going to use my friction pen just to mark the ends of those tucks, so all 4 markings. And then once I've done that, and I'm just going to get a different colour for that one in the middle of the blue, because blue on blue is not working great, and green is not really standing out, so I'll try my chalk pencil instead. I'm gonna just draw a line in from there just to give me like a heads up of where it was. There we go. So now that I've marked all of those in, I can peel back the pattern piece and take out these pins. I'm going to use the same method to mark the point of the dart, and I've already used this method to mark the kind of long dart here. I've already put pins in both of those edges, both of those dots there to mark those ones. I've also marked up this match point on the back of the collar, and I'm going to do the same for every pattern piece that needs to have these marks put in. So the back yoke, the back panel pieces as well. Just transfer all the markings over to the fabric so that I have reference points for then sewing up those darts, tucks and match points. Okay, so once you've put in the markings, you then want to join up the dots that you marked with the little snips that you've marked. And for these tucks, that's really easy, they're straight lines. For this dart, that's really easy, they're straight lines. For this dart at the top here, it's a little bit different because it is a curved dart, so that's where your French curve comes into play. So what I like to do is I will get my French curve, and then I'll kind of play around with the edge of this to work out where what fits in best. And once I've found the curve that fits the dart best, I'll make a note. So this one's starting at 42, and I will then use that to put the dart onto my piece of fabric. So I've got to find the other end. So there's one point, there is the first point. So I'm going to then take my French curve and I'll find 42, the 42 centimetre part there, and then I will draw in one side of the curve, flip it over, get the 42 lined up with my point again, and then draw the second one in. So I then have my fisheye dart marked in, and it matches nicely with the curve lines on the pattern piece. I'm going to go through and do the same for the back panel, marking all the tucks on there and any match points. Like this is a match point here. We've also got a match point up here on the collar. But make sure everything is marked in, then I can start sewing my darts together. Step one is to sew in the little darts at the neckline. It kind of breaks it all down for you. The instructions here are pretty good. And the tip to prevent a bubble at the point of each dart, make the last few stitches right in the fold and leave the thread's ends long to tie a knot. Do not backstitch at the points. Press the dart flat along the stitching to blend the stitches, then press dart towards the center. This is how I always do my darts as well. Sew off the ends and then tie them in threads in a knot so you don't get any puckers at the end of your darts and you don't end up with harsh points. There are lots of other ways to do it. This has just always been my way and a way that I particularly like. We're then going to do the darts at the underarm, so same thing. We're going to stitch those and then we're going to press the darts down. So the neck darts get pressed to the center, the bust darts gets pressed down. So we're going to get those sewn in and then we can move on to the pleats. Okay, I have sewn in the neck dart, I have sewn in the bust dart, and I've also sewn in the pleats at the waist. So the pleats at the waist I have backstitched at the end, that's fine. But the darts, as the pattern recommends, I have just stitched off the end and given myself some thread tails so that I can tie these into a knot to finish them off. So I like to tie, you don't want to pull this too tight because then you'll end up with a pucker at the end of the dart, which is what we're trying to avoid. But you do want these to be nicely secure. So I like to tie 3 knots and then I will trim away the excess thread and leave myself a little bit just to make sure that that doesn't come undone. And I've never had a dart come undone on me, and I've been sewing for 7-8 years now. So I'm going to do the same for my neck darts. Just tie these into knots like so, and the same the other side, because this is a double-ended dart. So tie this and knots as well. Okay, so I'm going to trim off all the excess thread and then we're going to press this one towards the center, this one down, and with the waist pleats we are pressing those towards the center front as well. So I'm going to do that for both of the fronts, and then I have pleats to sew into the back panel as well. So I'm going to get the pleats in the back panel done first, then I will take everything up to be pressed, because I like to do as many things as I can at the sewing machine before I get up and have to go and press them. For the pleats, all you are doing is, got a pleat in the middle here, there's 3 pleats on each of the back pieces. I haven't pinned this center one just because I've got these 2 pinned, but what you do with your pleats is, or what I like to do, is I put a pin through one point and bring it out at the other point of the pleat, and then kind of pinch that fabric together. I then match up the little notches that I've cut in at the end, and then I literally pin the whole way across, so I end up with something that looks like this, and the pin is going through the lines that we drew earlier on both sides. And then you start sewing at the bottom, backstitch, sew to the end of the pleat that you've marked with the point and backstitch there, and repeat for the other 2 pleats on each back section. So you'll end up with 3 pleats on each back section, so 6 in total. So I've got all my darts and pleats sewn in the fronts and the back. So the next thing I need to do is reinforce the corner, reinforce inner corner at neck edge, machine stitch along line for about 1 inch on each side of small dot, stitching through small dot as shown. Clip along solid line to small dot, being careful not to clip through the stitching. So we are going to be marking on lines around the small dot, which is at the end of the neck dart that we've made here. So we need to just reinforce this part here so that we can clip into this, which will then allow us to treat this as a separate piece of fabric and this as a separate piece of fabric to seam together. So I'm going to reinforce this area and then clip up to that small dot. So when I do need to do reinforcing stitches like this, I like to draw in my stitching line, and this is at 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. So I'm going to be using a slightly smaller stitch, as they say, about 1 inch away from the dot, the small dot, which is at the end of this neck dart. I'll pivot at this dot and then stitch about 1 inch this way. I won't back stitch, but like I say, I'm using a smaller stitch. So this is just reinforcing this piece here so that we can cut along this line here to open these areas up. These areas will then both get set into seams, which is going to reinforce this again. So we're just sewing this in here now so because there's no reinforcement at all. But once we have, that's why I'm not back stitching at either end. Once we've sewn these into seams, then this area will be reinforced again, and that's when you sew these into seams, that's when you're going to back stitch. So I'm going to use a slightly smaller stitch length, stitch up to the dot, pivot, and then this way, and I'm going to do that on both sides. And as I say, I've marked in my stitching lines, which is 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. I have sewn along those lines, as I say, to reinforce that area, and now I am going to snip in and up to, but not through, my stitching. And the closer you can get to your stitching without cutting through it, the smoother this point will be. But I've now created basically a new kind of, this is one piece of fabric, this is a second piece of fabric, as it were, rather than the one fabric with a right angle in it. This is just going to make pivoting at this point so much easier. So I'm going to do the same for the other side, then we can sew the back seam together. Okay, so the next thing that we're doing is, with right sides together, stitch centre back seam of front extensions from lower edge to small dot, back stitch at small dot to reinforce the seam. It's the back edge, centre back edge of our collar neckline that we are sewing together to that dot. That looks like, so they're the pieces that we have clipped into, and we've got the curved back of our collar here, and we marked on our dots earlier. So we're sewing from this raw edge up to the dot and back stitching at both ends to secure that into place. So we should end up with something that looks like this. We've got, these are our two front sections with the point reinforced and slit into on both sides. Then we've sewn the back of the collar together up to the small dot and back stitched, and we're going to press this open, if I can get it open, there we go. I'm going to press that open when we go to the ironing board. But we don't need to go to the ironing board quite yet. We're going to put our front pieces to the side for the moment, and if you haven't already sewn the tucks or the pleats into the back, you're going to sew those the same way that you sewed the pleats into the front. I did all my pleat sewing at the same time. So the next thing that we're going to do is stitch the two back pieces together along the centre back seam. I'm going to do this with a French seam, which means I'm going to pin mine wrong sides together and sew the first pass at 1/4 of an inch, trim, press, and then sew at 3/8 of an inch, press, and I will have a nicely enclosed seam. So I'll show you what that looks like as we go. Okay, so I have sewn the back panels together at the centre back with the wrong sides together at 1/4 of an inch. I am now trimming that down so it's just under 1/8 of an inch. I'm then going to take this to the ironing board and I will press it with the right sides together so that I can sew the seam with 3/8 of an inch to finish off the raw edge with a French seam. So I'm going to press the back pleats flat. I'm going to press the front pleats towards the front. I'm going to press the front darts down and the neck darts towards the centre. So that's going to be the next order operation, is get everything pressed. Press the centre back seam with the right sides together, and I am now sewing at 3/8 of an inch, which is going to enclose that raw edge and finish off the back seam nicely. And I'm just going to press it to the left. For example, it doesn't matter which way you press it as long as you press it flat once you've sewn it. So now that I have got the centre back seam closed, I'm going to move on to step number 6. Gather neck edge between the notches. There is a notch on the neck edge, so we're going to run gathering stitches from this notch to its matching notch on the other side. I like to do my gathering stitches 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge and then 3/8 of an inch away from that, so that the stitching line is then in the centre of the gathers. I find that gives me really nice gathers. You will need to make sure that your fabric will recover from having needle holes in it, though. You are stitching into what will be visible garment, so do test on a spare piece of fabric before you start stitching into your final fabric, just to make sure that it recovers from having needle holes in it. So we're on to step number 7, which is to stay stitch the back yoke, and you're going to stay stitch the upper and lower edges of it at 1/2 an inch, which is just inside the stitching line because the seam allowance on this pattern is 5/8 of an inch. So I've done this at the neck edge, which I think you can just about see there, and the lower edge. Stay stitching stays in permanently and helps prevent stretching on curved edges, and the stay stitching will not be shown in the following instructions. Clip to stay stitching at neck edge. At the moment we are not going to do any clipping because I'm going to wait and see if it's necessary, but it's nice to have the stay stitching in because, as they say, it's going to help you get the neck edges and the yoke put in without stretching anything out. So the next step is, with right sides together, pin the back section to the back yoke matching notches, pull the gathering stitches to fit, baste, stitch, press seam towards yoke. There are notches on here that match up with the notches that the gathering section will go into. So this part is the top end and there's going to be no gathering there, then there's going to be gathering all the way around to the other notch. I've also marked in the centre back to match up with the centre back seam that we've sewn in the back panels, just to make life a little bit easier. So I'm going to get all of this pinned into place and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so I have pinned the yoke to the back portion, and as we discussed, this is all flat up to the notches, and then from the notches it's all gathered into the back yoke. So I'm now going to stitch this at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to stitch it with the gathering side up because this is the side that I want to make sure everything is lying nice and flatly, and this side is nice and flat, so it's not going to misbehave. But this is the side that could kind of get twisted, or I could get like little puckers and things in there, which I don't want. So I'm going to sew it with this side up 5/8 of an inch the whole way around. So I have sewn my yoke to my back panels. Now, I don't personally like to overlock the raw edges of my garments, as you guys know. I don't feel like I could neatly French seam this because of all the gathering in it. So I've actually cut a second yoke, and I am now sandwiching the back panel between the two yokes. So I've got the right side of the outer yoke to the right side of the shirt, and then I've got the right side of the inner yoke to the wrong side of the shirt, and I'm going to pin that in place and stitch that down to sandwich that edge. I am going to trim all of the excess away and then press this up, and that will neatly finish the raw edge of my yoke and back panel seam where they come together. This is not in the pattern, this is something that I have decided to do. I've been thinking about how I wanted to finish this raw edge, and this is the method that I've come up with. So I've sewn that down, trimmed off all the excess, and now I have a neatly finished interior and exterior. So I need to remove the gathering stitches that are still on show, and then we'll press this all up so that the seam allowance is all pressed into the yoke. That's something that you would have done even if you hadn't have put this extra yoke on, and then we can start sewing our side seams together. The next step we have is 11, which is for view C, which is the short sleeve one that we're doing. With right sides together, pin front to back at shoulders and back neck edge, matching centre back notches and small dots. Stitch shoulder seams pivoting with needle and fabric at small dots at neck edge, trim back seams, clip curves, press shoulder seams open, pressing the neck seam towards the collar. I actually want to sew these shoulder seams with French seams because this is me we're talking about, and I'd like a nice clean finish on the inside. That is going to be possible because we clipped into this small dot earlier. So I'm going to actually ignore the instructions here, and I'm going to sew these shoulder seams as French seams. Then I'm going to sew the back of the collar from the front of the bodice to the back neckline on the back of the bodice, and I'll of course show you what I'm doing as I go along. Okay, it's starting to look a little bit like a shirt. So I have pinned the shoulder seams wrong sides together, and I've pinned them from the little dot that we clipped into earlier. There is a matching corresponding one on the yoke pieces, so I've made sure that they match up. There are some notches that we need to match up as well along the top here, which I think are behind this pin, and I'm now going to sew this at 1/4 of an inch and stop, and you're going to end up with it. So I don't know if you can see, here we go, there's the bit that we clipped into that dot earlier. So I'm going to stop sewing around about there, trim off all of the excess, then we'll press it right sides together so that we can sew the final part of the French seam. And again, I will show you what that looks like as we go, but I've got the front pinned to the back wrong sides together at the moment. So I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch both sides, and I'm going to make sure that the tiny little dots match up. That's the important part. Okay, so I have sewn the side seam at 1/4 of an inch all the way along. You can see there's the clip into the small dot, sewn it all the way along there. So I'm going to trim all the excess off along here, so it's less than 1/8 of an inch, so that I can then press it right sides together to then finish off that seam. So I've pressed this so the right sides are together, and I'm now going to sew this at 3/8 of an inch, which when we get to this point here is when I'm going to match up this little corner that we snipped into earlier with the match point on the back panel, the back yoke, and that's the important part. We need to make sure that this piece and this piece match up. So I'm going to pin that into place, stitch along here at 3/8 of an inch, which is going to finish the raw edge of the French seam, so the shoulder seams will be nicely finished and that we've got a nice matching neck point back here. Okay, so you should end up with something that looks like this. We've matched up the little point on our back yoke with the circle that we clipped into earlier, and that stay stitching that we did earlier has now been put into the actual seam of our shoulder seam. So if we open this up, our shoulder seam is nicely finished on the outside and the inside. I always prefer to sew my necklines with pivot points like this anyway. I don't like to try and pin everything, pivot at this point and then sew in one continuous seam. I like to back stitch at this point, take everything out from the machine and then reposition everything so that I get everything nice and flat, because I find otherwise I can end up with puckers in this area. So the next thing I'm going to do is match up the notches that we've got on the back collar with the notches that are in the back yoke and get the back neckline pinned from the back yoke to the back of the collar on the front bodice pieces. And once that's all pinned, you're going to sew from the small dot to the small dot, back stitching at the beginning and the end. And this is why we stay stitched the back neckline earlier, so that we can clip into this to make this lie a little flatter, to make this a bit easier. So I'm going to get this all pinned together. I'll show you what that looks like once we've sewn it. Okay, so we should end up with something that looks a bit like this. So you'll have these kind of like this is why we've reinforced this area, because there's a lot of, you know, we're pulling this quite far apart. The neckline has been stitched in, this has been stitched down open like that, and then on the other side, as you can see, the shoulder seam has met up with the neckline seam, and that's all been stitched into place as well. This is all going to get, this raw edge is going to get finished off when we put in our collar facing piece later. We are now going to go and press our seams towards the front. The French seam gets pressed towards the front because that's the way it's naturally going to want to lie because of what's going on here. So we're going to press the French seams, the shoulder seams towards the front, and we should end up with a nice kind of right angle with our neck dart here. This is the yoke and this is the collar piece. The next step will be to sew the underarm seams closed. I'm going to do mine with French seams. Because there is a corner here, I'm actually going to sew 3/8 of an inch first, trim, press, and then sew it 1/4 of an inch so that the curve has more maneuverability, because I don't want to clip into my stitching as I am doing French seams. Okay, so I've got all the side seams sewn and I have pressed them towards the back. We are now going to work on the facing. So you want to apply your interfacing to your facing piece. I have done that, and it depends on what type of interfacing you're using as to how that goes, so just use the manufacturer's instructions. The next thing that we need to do is reinforce to the small dot, because we need to be able to separate this into two seams like we did with the shirt front. So I have marked in the stitching lines, so these are 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge and about an inch long, and I'm going to reduce my stitch length. I'm going to sew, pivot and sew. I won't back stitch at either end though. Then we can clip into and up to the dot to free those two seams. We also need to finish this raw edge of the facing. I'm going to use bias binding. You could overlock, you could pink, whatever your preferred method. Mine is going to be bias binding. So we are working on the facing. Step 14, press under 5/8 of an inch on shoulder edge, stitch close to raw edge, press under 1/4 of an inch on unnotched edge of facing, stitch close to raw edge, and then with right sides together, stitch centre back of seam of front facing from lower edge to small dot, back stitch at small dot to reinforce the seam. So we want to end up with something that looks like this. So I have finished my raw edges with bias binding rather than turning them under and stitching them. I have pressed under, let's turn this over so you can see. So I have pressed under the 5/8 of an inch. I haven't stitched it down as yet, but I will do that next, and I'll stitch it down along here to keep that into place. I have stitched the back neckline together from the raw edge up to the small circle, which I have pressed out because I used a friction pen to press this seam open. So I've ended up with something that looks like, if I can do this with one hand, there we go. I've ended up with something that looks like this. So I'm just going to stitch these edges down, and then we can start putting this together with our shirt to finish off the raw edges at the front and the neckline. Okay, I have my facing pinned to my shirt, right sides together. I have marked on my seam allowances, so I have my pivot points for the collar and also for the bottom corner here, because we're going to sew at 5/8 of an inch from the edge of the facing, pivot up the front edge all the way to the collar, and then along the back of the collar. And this bit is a little tricky. We are sewing to the small dot. Now that's gone because I've pressed it, but I can tell where it is because that's where the stitching line ends. So this side is not too bad, but this other side, because we've pressed the seam open and the small dot is kind of like in there, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to sew to around about here. I'm going to back stitch and stop, and then I'm going to turn the work over so that I can sew it from the other side, because this is the side that's going to misbehave. This side's nice and flat at the moment. I'm going to back stitch when I get to the small dot, then I'll rearrange everything and do the other side in exactly the same manner all the way down to the hem. So to actually get to those small notches, I ended up cutting into the seam allowance, and I'm going to be trimming this all back anyway, so I trimmed into the seam allowance so that I could get to that small circle that we marked earlier and get it sewn in. So I've done that on both sides, and I am now going to go and trim off the excess at the points and corners, trim the seam allowance down the whole way around so that when I turn it through it will press nicely. That's going to involve, as I say, cutting down some of this seam allowance around these curves here. Once that's done, I can turn it through and get everything pressed, so I'll show you what that looks like when we get it done. I clipped and trimmed all the seam allowance and turned everything to the right side, and I have pressed everything nice and flat. I have turned under the hem allowance twice and pressed that the whole way along the back, so I can now sew that down. I have also pressed under the seam allowance on the back neck edge, which means that I'll be able to slip stitch that into place to enclose all of the raw edge, and then I will slip stitch the shoulder seam to the shoulder seam to keep that in place as well. Then we are on to adding the cuffs and buttons and buttonholes. So this is starting to look very much like a finished shirt. I'm going to get all the slip stitching done, and I'm also going to get the hemming done. I'm going to do this by machine and the other bit by hand. Okay, so I have prettily finished insides. I'm really glad that I did this extra yoke piece to finish off this edge, and it's worked out really well. It hasn't added too much bulk to any of these seams around here. This is all slip stitched into place, so that's all finished. The French seams at the shoulder seams are good. The French seams at the side seams are good. Pretty happy with that. I have machine hemmed the rolled hem that I did previously. The pattern does say that you can continue stitching around the front edge if you want to, and I'm thinking I maybe might do that for some decorative top stitching all the way around to the collar and around the other side, but I've not 100% made my mind up on that yet. The next thing that we need to do is finish off the armholes, and they are going to be finished with these cuffs. So we're going to skip ahead to sleeve C, and it says, note, you have cut 4 sleeve band sections. 2 will be referred to as facings. So apply the interfacing to the sleeve bands with the right sides together, stitch ends of sleeve band. Okay, we can do that, and as the pattern says, we have 4 of those, 2 with interfacing on and 2 without. So with right sides together, we're going to stitch these short ends together at 5/8 of an inch. I have sewn the short ends together at 5/8 of an inch and pressed it open, and I have pinned an interfaced band to an uninterfaced band around the slightly larger edge or the unnotched edge, and we are going to stitch ends of sleeve band facing with right sides together, pin sleeve band facing to matching band seams, stitch in 3/8 of an inch 1 centimetre, leaving notched edge open as shown, and trim seam. We'll need to then turn it out, press it and baste the raw edges together. I have sewn my bands together at 3/8 of an inch, and then I have trimmed down the seam allowance, so I can now turn them through and wrong sides together and then go and press them. And then I'm gonna, it says to baste the edges together. I tend not to do that because I find that I can wrangle the fabric, and especially something like this cotton, which behaves itself nicely, I find that I don't necessarily need to do that. But if you find it easier, then baste this edge together at 1/4 of an inch so that it's within the seam allowance. So I'm going to get these pressed and then we can get them attached to the shirt. I have pressed my sleeve bands, and whilst I was doing that I also pressed in half my sleeve facing. I pressed it in half before I sewed it together because I find it easier to press a straight piece of fabric rather than a circle like this. So pressed it in half, and then I have sewn the short ends together at 5/8 of an inch, pressed that open and then pressed it again to get a nice crisp finish. So the sleeve facings are done, so I'm going to put those to the side for now. Okay, so we're on step 34. Turn band right side out, press, baste raw edges together. On outside, pin band to sleeve edge matching underarm seams and notches, and baste. Okay, I've decided to skip a step, and I've decided to skip the basting step. I've pinned my cuff and my sleeve facing to the sleeve opening all in one go to sew all at the same time. I am confident that I can get this to all lie flat and do as it's told. If you are worried about that, then basting is the option. So when we're sewing in the sleeve facing, we are sewing this with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you're going to baste, you want to baste at 1/4 of an inch so that none of your stitching will be visible and you won't have to remove any of your basting stitching. As I say, I am going to wing it, and I am going to try and sew it all in one go. We will see how this turns out. I shall let you know if I am successful in the next clip. Wish me luck. Okay, that worked really well. So I now need to turn the sleeve facing, or sleeve facing, and understitch it to the seam allowance to make sure that everything is going to roll nicely to the inside. It doesn't say anywhere in the instructions I'm reading through now, it doesn't say anywhere in the instructions to trim the seam allowance down. So I think what I'll do is I'll understitch first, and then I'm going to trim the seam allowance down a little bit because it's quite bulky in this area. We've got lots of layers. We've got the shirt itself, we've got the interface part of the cuff, the uninterfaced part of the cuff, and then the 2 layers of the sleeve facing as well. So we've got 5 layers through here. So what I'll do first is I will understitch the sleeve facing to the seam allowance, and I'm going to do that 1/8 of an inch away from the stitching line. I'm then going to trim this excess seam allowance away so that when we turn it through and top stitch it down to the inside, which trying to do that with turn it all with one hand, a bit difficult, so it doesn't end up super bulky in that area. None of the kind of seam allowance is going to show through because at the moment it's actually the same, the seam allowance is the same width as the folded edge of the seam facing. So I'm going to understitch first, then I will trim, then I'll press, then I'll top stitch. Okay, so I trimmed down my seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch. I trimmed really close to the understitching. I've then taken this over to the ironing board and pressed everything under. So the next step is to top stitch the sleeve facing to the sleeve, but to make sure that the cuff is free. So I'm going to turn the cuff out like this so that I don't catch the cuff in any way. That's something I want to be really careful about. And I'm going to use my edge stitch foot to top stitch this edge down all the way around, and when you turn the cuff back through, the top stitching will be hidden. So I'm going to get that done for both sides, then we can move on to buttons and buttonholes. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is mark our buttonhole placement on. So I have my front bodice piece and I've drawn in the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance so that I can put the pattern piece over my finished shirt and line up those finished edges with the seam allowance that I've drawn in. I've then made holes through the buttonholes and I've marked them in with a pen So we've got one there, one there, one there, and one there. So I'm now going to grab myself some buttons and make the buttonholes with my machine. I'm not going to show you how I do it with my machine because every single machine is different. So you will just need to follow your manufacturer's instructions. That is how I got the placement for my buttonholes. I have literally just used the pattern. Okay, so now that my buttonholes are in, I need to mark the placement for my buttons. So I have pinned together the two front edges, matching up the bottom edge to make sure everything is nice and flush and even with each other. And I'm going to take a final pin and poke it through the buttonhole like that, and use my friction pen, a giant pigeon fight outside, to mark the placement of my button. And I'm going to do that for each of my buttonholes. Okay, so once my button placement is marked in, I can unpin everything. I've got buttons stuck to my arm. I can unpin everything, and I am then going to use fray check on my buttonholes. And I like to use fray check on my buttonholes before I open them up. So I'm going to use my fray check, and I am going to go over all of the buttonhole stitching and the inside of the buttonhole on the outside and the interior of my garment. I find that this will still give me little fraying pieces when I open my buttonholes up, but they tend to be a little bit stiffer and easier to trim away. So I've done the outside. I'm going to turn it over and do exactly the same to the inside. And whilst this is drying, I will then sew on my buttons by hand. I can do it on the machine, but I'm going to do it by hand. So just saturate the other side of my buttons with the fray check. And we're going to leave this to dry. As I say, button sewing on whilst this is drying. I will show you how I open those up when we get to it. Okay, so ideally we would use a buttonhole chisel to open these up, but since the move we can't find ours, we don't know where it is. So I am going to put a pin in the end of the buttonhole under that bar tack, and I'm going to use my seam ripper to open up the buttonhole. So I've pushed through, and I'm going to gently and carefully open up the buttonhole, and that pin at the end will just mean that my seam ripper won't be able to go any further through the buttonhole than I want it to. So I'm going to do that for all of them, and then we have a tiny little bit of hand finishing to do on the cuff and we're done. So the final thing that the pattern would like us to do is press the band up along edge of facing, stitch sleeve band to blouse at underarm seam as shown. So we're just going to stitch through the cuff to the main body of the shirt just to make sure that the cuff band itself doesn't actually flip around. So I'm going to get that done. Once that's done, we are finished with our shirt. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. Again, this is a lovely pattern. It's a well-written pattern. It's just not for me. I don't think it's something that I would ever reach for in my wardrobe. I'm not immediately going to donate it, but I can imagine that it's not going to survive in my wardrobe for very long. But I am glad that I tried it, and thank you to the Patreon peeps for voting for it. So if you have enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!